Hello friends, it's Shari. I have a fun and colorful birthday card to share with you today using the Build a Bee die set. So the Build a Bee has this hive and this cute little bee. I've cut my pieces here. I'm going to go ahead and assemble some parts of my bee. Now for my bee, I used sunflower cardstock for the yellow, which is this solid piece here. And for my black details, the stripes and the little antenna piece, I use black sparkle cardstock. So my bee has some really fun shimmer. So I'm just using liquid glue to layer these pieces together. One other thing that I am going to do is the fallout piece for the little head details here. I'm going to use that to fill in the eyes and the mouth. There is a die in the set, so if you wanted to cut it a different color, you certainly could. But since I want to use the same sparkle cardstock, I'm just going to use my little scrap to fill in his face. Now I'm not going to completely assemble him just yet because I'm not sure how I want his head to tilt on my card. So I will set him aside and we're going to work on the beehive. Now I wanted a rainbow beehive because essentially this is the birthday cake. It is a beehive shaped birthday cake. And I just decided to color this with my markers using those little stitched lines in between the segments of the beehive as my guide. So I picked out a rainbow of colors to start with. Now there are there are 7 segments to this. I did pick out 8 colors because I used the last and final color, which is purple, for the icing detail at the bottom, which you'll see here in just a little bit. And I am just swiping across one color for each of these segments. So I started with pink, red, orange, yellow, green, teal, and then blue. And then what I did was I took those exact same markers and I went for a second layer, pulling it in from the outside edges to kind of give it some shading and some shape to make these segments look like they're rounded. I'm not even changing the color, I'm simply adding a second layer that is a little bit darker on the outside edges to give it that nice shape and detail. And then the solid piece that goes behind will be narwhal. Now here is where build a cake comes into play. I cut the icing detail from white, and this is where I'm going to add my 8th color, which is purple. So this will go right along the bottom. I also used the cake plate, that's the little pedestal, and that is where I'm going to put my beehive cake. Now for some other fun birthday details, I'll use some stamped images. I'm using Hats Off to You for a party hat and Yappy Birthday for that little bundle of balloons. And I am just going to stamp these in jet black ink. Now depending on how much partying you wanted on your card, you could find some little presents or some party horns, all the fun birthday things in your favorite birthday sets to add to this cute little scene. For the colors on these stamped images, I'm just using the exact same colors that I used for my beehive. So I have my purple and my green for the party hat. For the balloons, I'm going to pull in some pink. And for these, I'm kind of going to use that same trick of just a second layer of ink, at least on the pink and the teal. For the yellow here, I did actually pull in a darker yellow to create some shading because yellow is so light that a second layer doesn't really show up as well. So I will pull in a darker marker just for a little shading where those balloons touch. And then for the last balloon, I'm using that aqua color. And so now I know that my stamped images are going to match my beehive cake perfectly because I used all the same markers. They were still sitting on my desk. And then finally, I'll use the coordinating dies to cut each of these images out. And here are all my pieces for my beehive birthday cake. For the background, I'm going to use the new Giddy for Gingham collection. I love this new collection, and I'm actually using the 12 by 12 sheet because the gingham is a bit larger. I'm using the largest of the outside in stitch rectangles to cut this out, and when I'm using the orthogonal side like this, I like to make sure it's nice and even and that rectangle is square on that grid. Now I can assemble my beehive by just layering this over that solid piece. It fills in the door. I also have the cake plate, which I cut from fog, but I do end up changing this, and you're going to see that here in a little bit. And then we have our icing to finish off our rainbow at the bottom and really make this look like a cake. So I am going to add my gingham to my card base, and right here, I wish you were here because you could have told me I put this upside down and I didn't even realize it till later. But I did decide I wanted to add some details to this, which I should have done before I put this on the card base, but here we are. And what I'm doing is I'm taking just a gray blue pin that I had that matches really nicely, and I'm adding some hand-drawn stitching details to my pattern. And I just think this is a really fun way to kind of kick it up a notch with some pattern paper and add your own spin. The other thing I like to do with this giant gingham is to add tiny images in the squares. For me, I just pulled out a set that was sitting on my desk that had a tiny heart. You can find lots of tiny images in your sets in your stash. I pulled out some kiddie pool ink because it matches this blue very nicely, and I'm just stamping that tiny little heart in the gingham to make it look like it was printed that way. Now for these ones on the edge, this is why I should have done this before putting it onto the card base. I did get a little bit on my white card, so I'm going to fix this one with a white gel pen. Then I'm going to use my scrap piece of paper over here to mask off the rest of the edges while I stamp those partial hearts on the sides. So again, these stamping details would have been easier before I put it on the card base, but sometimes you think of fun ideas after you've glued something down. Now for my hive, this is where I decided to change out the plate to dolphin cardstock. I thought that stood out a little bit more. I also pulled out a white pen and I'm adding some little white details to the hive itself. I'm taking those balloons that I colored earlier and I'm tucking them behind my icing at the bottom so I look like there's a bunch of balloons kind of tethered to the bottom of the beehive. And now I need to work on my sentiment. And I'm using the new Henry's Build a Sentiment Honeybee set to put the sentiment buzzing by to say Happy Bee Day. So I want the first part of my sentiment to kind of curve around the top of my beehive. So I'm just putting that on a block and adjusting that curve so it looks really good. And I'm just going to stamp this directly onto the background. And my cake here is just here for placement. It is not yet adhered down to my card base. So there's the first part of my sentiment, and then I have a stitch sentiment banner cut from peach cardstock for the second half of my sentiment. Now I can add my beehive cake to my card using some foam adhesive. I love popping these big cakes up on a card like this. I also want to pop up the sentiment banner, and I like to flip it over and see as a guide where to put my foam squares. So I know not to put any in the center. I can put a little bit of liquid glue right there, and I made sure my foam squares were on the left and the right to avoid the little bottom of the cake pedestal. And here's where I realized, oh, I put this all on upside down. But we're going to fix that and I'm going to show you how I did. But first, I'm going to finish decorating my card. So I have my little bee and I want it to have its head tilted to the left. Then I can add the party hat, which I just think is so cute. This bee is ready to party. Now for the wings, I decided I wanted them all on one side. So I'm cutting them apart. And I'm actually going to add a glue dot to the back. I actually added two so that it was a little bit bigger because I couldn't find my big glue dots. And this is a good way to add those wings. And I can kind of adjust them, make sure they're in the position I want them to be. My little bee is going to go up here at the top of my hive. So I'm putting my foam squares only behind the hat and the top of the head and the wings. The rest is going to overlap onto the hive, and I can use liquid glue for that area. And I like him right up here where the sentiment starts. I think that's really fun. So let me show you how I fixed my upside down card problem. I'm just going to trim this right on the fold. So now I just have a card front. Then I can grab another card base from my stash and I will just add this whole thing to a new card base and now it's right side up. So a really easy fix. But I do want to do this before I add my embellishments and my glitter. So now it's time for some embellishments, which I pulled out the iridescent sequins, and I'm just placing them around like confetti. Once I have them where I want them, then I will start to glue them down. I like to make sure they are all in the right place and they look the way I want before I glue them down. And then finally, for some glitter, I'm adding it to the wings, the dots of the party hat, a little bit on the balloons, and the icing detail at the bottom of the cake, and just a little on the cake here and there. And then here is our finished Build a Bee slash Build a Cake B-Day card. I just think it's so cute. I love all the puns and the sentiment too. I think it's really fun. So thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you have an amazing day. Bye.